Well, hello everybody, and welcome to this online event this evening. My name is Graham Bynon. I'm one of the leaders at Grace Church who's organised this. The majority of people, I think, are on this Zoom meeting. Some people may have joined via our Facebook streaming, so hello to you if you're there. We're going to have a chance for some communication and questions and things later on. I'll explain how you do that either on Zoom or on Facebook when we're a little bit closer to that point in the evening. The coronavirus pandemic has obviously thrown the world into turmoil, and any major catastrophe like this often raises the question of God and suffering. The question, of course, we should realize is actually there all the time, because there is suffering in the world all the time. Thousands of people suffer from illness and tragedy every day, but it's dispersed, it's spread out. We think of it as normal, it doesn't hit the headlines. The difference with a major event like a tsunami or a pandemic in this case, it doesn't so much change the reality of suffering as alert us to that reality in a more focused way. It makes us more conscious of it. And that then is what often raises the question for people of God and suffering. Where is God in a coronavirus world? The question in its usual form says, if God's good and God's all powerful, why would he allow suffering? That leads on to questions like our heading for this evening. Where is God in a pandemic like this? What is he doing, if anything? It's a question that's been reflected on through a lot of human history, and we shouldn't expect to be finding a simple solution to it in the next hour or so. Our hope is we'll get some perspective, we'll get some kind of purchase on the question, and it'll help each of us in our own thinking, wherever we're starting from. Some people, of course, respond to suffering in the world by feeling affirmed that there can't be a God. It is a piece of evidence against believing in God. And if that's you, I hope this will at least give you pause and help you think that through more. Some people actually respond to suffering by thinking maybe there is a God and maybe he can help make sense of all of this, what's going on. Well, I hope if that's you, this will give some kind of direction for you. What we're going to do is listen to a talk by John Lennox. John is an emeritus professor at Oxford University, where he taught maths. Alongside that day job, as it were, John spoke a great deal in defense of the Christian faith on topics like this one. He's debated people like Richard Dawkins and others. And he's just recently written a book very quickly, called Where is God in a Coronavirus World? The title for it this evening. He refers to that book within his talk, and the talk itself is a summary of a few bits of the book. This talk was given just under 2 weeks ago online from John's home, as you'll see in a moment. And it's given to students at Oxford University. At the start, he begins with some sympathetic comments to the experience of Oxford students during lockdown. You don't have to feel sympathetic for them if you don't want to, that's fine. We're going to do three things. We're going to listen to that talk. That takes about 20 minutes. I'm going to make just a few additional comments that I hope will highlight a couple of things, maybe expand a couple of things. And then we're going to have some time for questions. John will refer to questions in his talk. The session he did for the students was followed by a Q&A. We thought it, rather than listening to their questions though, we thought we'd have our own question and answer time. I'm afraid that does mean you don't get to hear him answering. You're stuck with me and possibly a few others who might chip in but we thought it would be better if we had our own question time rather than using theirs. But he does say, note questions down as you go along. If you'd like to do that, please do. We're going to be using the chat in Zoom. If you'd like to write questions in the chat, and if you'd like to write them even as the talk is going on, feel free, or you can write them towards the end. If you're on the Facebook, you can write them in the comment section there, and Rob, who's running our tech, will pick them up and put them into the Zoom meeting. If you'd like to ask questions directly live, as it were, then we'll be able to do that as well, and I'll explain how we do that when we get to that stage. So there'll be time for questions. Do be thinking of those as we go along. So for now, I'll hand over, as it were, to John Lennox, and we'll hear from him.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I've been involved in many webinars and interviews all around the world, of course, in cyberspace in the past couple of weeks. And with my wife, we're locked down just outside Oxford. And let me first say that I really sympathize with students who are locked down at the moment and having difficulty in organizing tutorials and missing all that is so wonderful about university life in Oxford. And it's my hope that this won't get in the way of your eventual degrees and so on. But we're facing a very difficult situation. And because I'm a mathematician and know a little bit about statistics, I could see right at the beginning that this was going to very rapidly, in fact, exponentially, go round the globe. And I thought I would sit down and try to write something, because this is, in one sense, the hardest problem we face, the problem of evil and suffering. And what I want to do in the next few minutes is to give you some ideas that you may want to discuss. So please write your questions while I'm talking. Otherwise, the questions will all concentrate in the last minute of the talk. So write them down as I'm talking, and we'll do our best to say something about them. I say do my best because there are no easy solutions here. But I do believe, and that's why I'm speaking to you tonight, that Christianity has something to say, something very important to say, into the web of complications that are woven by a global pandemic like this. And people are full of uncertainty, full of even fear, job losses, and you know all the problems that are besetting us. So let's have a look at this problem. It seems to me that there are two basic problems and two perspectives to look at them. Firstly, there's the problem of moral evil, the bad things people do to one another. Then there's the problem of what we sometimes call natural evil, although it's an unfortunate phrase. That is where tragedy occurs and there's no obvious human complicity with it. Tsunamis, earthquakes, and so on. That's natural evil. And those two problems face us with very big questions indeed. There's also the fact that they can be linked, because often moral evil, for example, greed, can lead to people, for instance, deforesting a large region of the earth and turning it into a desert. And the end result is that people starve. And so it starts with moral evil and then it ends up as a disaster. So it is complex. And we see that even with COVID-19, because it is quite possible that they tell us that this virus jumped from animals to human beings. Why did it do that? Well, one widely accepted theory is it's because animals, wild animals that should have been free to roam in their environment, were housed in very cramped conditions that stressed them to such an extent they defecated, and viruses were spread into the air all around them. So it could be that part of the reason it started, at least, was moral evil, people wanting to benefit from this kind of thing. But of course, we're not blaming in that sense those people for every death that has sadly ensued in the wake of it. But it is very complicated. Then there are two perspectives. It's one thing to watch on television, as we do, doctors and nurses bravely fighting on the front line to save people's lives and risk their own at the same time. It's another thing to actually suffer from the coronavirus. And so there are intellectual questions we ask, but there are also emotional states that we have to cope with. And one of the reasons I'm a Christian is that I find the person of Jesus Christ so impressive when it comes to sensitivity to people's needs. There's a famous story in the Gospel of John where Jesus raised a man from the dead, but it raises a number of the coronavirus problems. There were two sisters, Mary and Martha. Their brother Lazarus was ill, and they sent a message to Jesus saying, the one you love is ill. And of course they expected him to come, but he didn't come. And the man died. And eventually Jesus did come. And the first sister, Martha, met him and said, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. And that's one of the problems people raise today. Where is God? We're social distancing. Is God social distancing, or does he just not exist? The interesting thing is the sisters believed in his power to heal, but he didn't come. So was he not willing to heal? And that's a very ancient problem. It's the problem of Epicurus, repeated by David Hume, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher. And it is this statement, Epicurus's questions are not answered. Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he's impotent. Or is he able but not willing? Then he's malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then this evil? And that echoes down through history. Well, what happened was that Jesus said to this woman, your brother will rise again. And they immediately embarked on a fairly high-powered academic discussion about the nature of resurrection at the last day, in which Martha believed. But then she remembered her sister, who was sitting in the house, very distraught. And the sister arrived. She said exactly the same words to Jesus. Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. But he didn't embark on a high-powered discussion. She burst into tears. And that's exactly what he did. He wept. And that shows sensitivity, because there are many people out there. You may be one of them, or your relatives or friends or loved ones. And they're not looking for a high-powered discussion and intellectual answers from Oxford students. What they want is a touch or a hug. And it must be awful to have to say goodbye to a loved one without even a hug or a touch, as many people have had to do. So we've got to respond to this in both ways, answering the intellectual questions as best we can with all true humility, because there are no simplistic answers. But secondly, showing that we empathize, that we sympathize. And of course, the answer to their distress then was that Jesus raised a man from the dead. And in a sense, that is what Christianity ultimately has to offer. The man Lazarus died, and so shall we all, inevitably. But the question is there hope beyond death, whether that death comes through a road accident or COVID-19? And I firmly believe there is, which is another reason why I am a Christian, because Christianity, as I see it, competes with no other religion, because it's only here that we find a satisfactory answer to the problem of human death and to the problem of human relationship with God. So what about our reactions to this? Well, I was in New Zealand just after the earthquake, and I found there were basically three reactions. There were Christians who quoted the Bible and hung on to their trust in God, quoting for example, God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. We will not fear, even though the earth gives way and the mountains fall into the sea, which was what was happening in the earthquake in New Zealand. But then there were other people who said, look, if people are suffering, it is because of their karma, and they're suffering because they haven't behaved. And therefore, you shouldn't really help them, because all you're doing is causing more suffering in a future life. That, to my mind, is an extremely cruel doctrine. But then there are other people who say, look, this is the judgment of God. These people must have been terrible in order to have this inflicted upon them. And people are saying that today. But then another group say, look, isn't it obvious that the solution to this is that there is no God at all? And we should just go with Richard Dawkins, who says the universe is just as we'd expect it to be. If at bottom there's no evil, no good, no justice, DNA just is, and we dance to its music. That's, of course, fatalism in its extreme, and it is utterly hopeless. And Richard Dawkins agrees that it's grim, and says that because it's grim, it doesn't mean it's false. And I said, no, but because it's grim, it doesn't mean it's true. We need better evidence than this. Now, I have huge difficulties with the atheist solution. Let me say one or two things first, and you can quiz me later. The first is that it does appear to offer, at least temporarily, an intellectual solution. That is just how it is. Brute fact, the universe is a mess. But secondly, it leaves the suffering. It doesn't alleviate it. In fact, it could be argued to make it worse. Why? Because it is hopeless. There is no hope beyond the grave in atheism. And so there is no ultimate hope to offer to people dying of COVID-19 or anything else. So that's a huge problem for atheism. But my concern is whether it's true or not. And I find it very difficult to square atheism, first of all, with our sense of good and evil. Dostoevsky once said, if there is no God, everything is permitted, by which he meant there's no rational justification for morality if God does not exist. And the odd thing is that atheists will say, look, this is an awful evil, but where do they get the concept from? It seems to me to be to evaporate on the basis of their atheism. So I turn from that and I go back to the hard situation that I'm in, which is I do believe in God, and therefore I have a real problem with this. Now, the problem comes in several forms. First of all, back to David Hume. And we've all argued about this, especially when we're students. Surely a good God would, could, etc., have done this and that and the other thing. And we argue about God's love and his power, and we never come to any satisfactory solution. Well, as a mathematician, when you're trying to solve a problem and you fail to solve it, especially after a few hundred years, you might wake up to the fact there may be other questions that will lead you further. And the fact is, and I trust you'll agree with me, that all of us, whatever our worldview, are faced with a mixed picture. We see, on the one hand, beauty. I went out the other night, looked through my telescope at the Orion Nebula, spectacular. I come in and I see an intensive care ward with people breathing their last. So it's beauty and it's coronavirus, or as I often say, beauty and barbed wire. That is our world. And no worldview worthy of the name that doesn't accept that can get anywhere. And as a Christian, I accept that. So what do I say about it? Well, I can't solve the problem, the deep philosophical problem, but I can say this, that there's another question, and it's equally hard, that I ask. That question is, granted that we're facing a mixed picture, Is there any evidence anywhere that there is a God that we could trust with it? Now, that's a hard question, but I believe there is. And it takes me back to the tears that Jesus shed in Bethany 20 centuries ago. They weren't crocodile tears. Jesus was disturbed at what death had done to this little family, but he was going to solve it in an utterly unique way by himself, dying on a cross and rising again. Because our problems aren't simply problems of health, physical or mental. Our problem is that we've been running away from God, many of us, for a long time. And something needs to happen about that. And as we trace the story back, we discover there's an original connection with the introduction of moral evil into the world and the brokenness of the physical creation. Sin, the Bible tells us, introduced human death into the world, thorns and thistles. And there is a sense in which our damaged world is evidencing for us the results of centuries, indeed millennia, of the consequences of sin. And the big question is, what does God do about it? And he does something massive about it. I didn't engineer the whole problem, nor did you. And God doesn't expect me or you to engineer the solution. In Christ's death on the cross and his resurrection, God provides a way where he can forgive us the mess we've made of our own lives and the lives of others, and give us a new life that COVID-19 cannot touch. But I need to say something before I close about the accusation that some people make that this is God's judgment on certain people. Now, we read of plagues in the Bible for which God was responsible, but we need to be careful before we extrapolate that to COVID-19, because as far as I know, there is no directive from God to tell us why COVID-19 happened. Indeed, most viruses are not pathogenic. They are necessary for our lives. Only a few of them are pathogenic. These are the thorns and thistles of which Genesis speaks. There's an incident in the life of Christ that helps us very much to understand what's going on. He was once on the Temple Mountain in Jerusalem, and the people in the crowd said to him, you know, Pilate and his soldiers came here and massacred a group of people while they were worshiping. That's moral evil. And Jesus said an interesting thing. He said, do you think they were worse than anybody else around at the time? And also, he then told them, there was the Tower of Siloam, also in Jerusalem, that collapsed on 18 people and they died. Do you think they were worse sinners than anybody else? I tell you, they were not. Now, this is extremely important because it is a statement by Christ himself that when you see a tragedy, you must not necessarily assume that the people who are victims of it are necessarily worse than anybody else. Now, of course, tragedies can happen directly because of our sin. If I get drunk and crash a car, I could kill myself. But the important thing is we mustn't read into every tragedy the direct judgment of God. Then Jesus said, and gave them a take-home lesson. He said, except you repent, you shall all likewise perish. Now, of course, he didn't mean that they would be massacred or that a tower would fall on them. But what I think he did mean was, when you see tragedy, especially on the scale of a pandemic, it reminds you that we all are going to die. C.S. Lewis once said that pain was God's megaphone to wake us up. And here we are in Europe, which has not even got the word God in its constitution. We've been running away from God for ages. We have stopped thinking about our own mortality. And this pandemic has reminded us that we are extremely vulnerable. We're not in charge. We will all die one way or the other. So in one sense, it acts as a wake-up call, or should act and make us think of God and eternity. And when people say to me, where is God in a coronavirus world? I'm tempted to say to them, where was he in your world before the coronavirus? Were you looking for him? Have you found him? Because in a coronavirus world, he's in exactly the same place that he was before. He's offering you a great gift if you're prepared to put your trust in him. He's offering you a gift of peace with God, eternal life, forgiveness, and that life will transcend death. COVID-19, as I said earlier, cannot touch it. But the question for all of us is, can we see the evidence that God is trustworthy? That's why the Gospels were written. And I would just say to all of you, you're all intelligent students at Oxford, don't reject Christianity until you have listened to what it says, because nowhere else are you going to find a message that faces you as you are, doesn't pretend that you're any better than you are, but offers you a relationship with God of which you can be certain right now. You see, the problem is that many religions simply give us a set of rules and regulations so that we merit God's acceptance. And this is so widespread that often people think Christianity is just another do-it-yourself, merit-based religion. It is not. We cannot merit God's forgiveness, nor his love. He's prepared to give it, though, absolutely freely if we accept it. And that is the unique thing about the Christian faith. So thank you for listening to me. It's been brief. You can get the book. I think it's cost less than a cup of coffee these days, and it's available in over 20 languages at the moment. And I look forward now to listening to your questions. Thank you very much.
Well, welcome back. I hope you found that interesting, informative, helpful. I'm just going to make a few additional comments. I thought it might be helpful to partly summarize some of what John said, to give some structure to a little bit of it, and add a couple of quick thoughts. I don't mean to know more about this than he does. He's the real expert, but I thought that might be helpful and give you a little bit of time and space to kind of digest and reflect and think of some questions. So I've got 4 things I wanted to say quickly. The first is to echo that idea that there are no simple answers for anybody. Every philosophy of life has to come up with some sort of explanation of this. I guess that there is a simple solution. The simple solution is that of the atheist, who says suffering just is. It is just part of the world. There is no God, and so we just expect it to be like this. And you may be drawn to that answer, and that is understandable in many ways. Many people find that unsatisfactory, though, for at least a couple of reasons. One might be because they feel there is other evidence for the existence of God, and so the question is raised. But also, as John was intimating, that doesn't fit with their experience. The atheist's answer has to be that life is meaningless, it is going nowhere, and suffering is just part of the deal. And there's no point railing against it, saying it's not fair, because DNA just is. Many of us feel there must be more to life than that. We have a deep instinct that suffering and evil tell us there are things wrong with the world. Now, Christianity, I don't think, like any of the worldviews, has a simple solution, but it does have an explanation for why suffering is in the world. And that's the second thing I wanted to focus on. I wanted to highlight some elements John mentioned, which kind of put together give us the story of the Bible. And that story begins with the world being created, a good place without suffering. It was not God's intention that it would be there. But the world has then fallen. John referred to the idea of sin in the world, where people turn against God. And that is what has opened the door, as it were, and brought suffering and pain into the world and the natural. That's why the world is such a mixture of beauty and ugliness, as John was saying, pleasure and pain. The Christian view is it's a good creation, now twisted. And the story goes on to say that then God has done something about that in Jesus, who came to bring restoration through his own suffering, through his death and resurrection. Restoration for us in relationship with him, ultimately a new creation that is free of suffering. So you see, there's the whole Bible storyline, created and then spoiled and then restored. And so John referred to Jesus's comments on people who suffered when the tower fell, or people who were murdered. And Jesus says, well, it's not that they're more guilty than anybody else. It wasn't that they particularly deserved it. But when you see suffering like that, and when we see suffering like with COVID-19, it tells us this world is not what it was supposed to be. And people should see that, as it were, and see it's a good world, spoiled, but there is the option of restoration. So it gives an explanation. It also says that God is a God who has entered into our world, a God who knows what suffering is like. He doesn't stand aloof from it. And that's why John spoke of its giving answers beyond just the intellectual ones, giving comfort. Thirdly, I want to say that even within that storyline, the Bible takes the issue of unjust suffering very seriously. There's a book in the Bible called the Book of Job, about a man called Job. You may have heard of him. And he suffers seemingly for no good reason. It is unjust suffering. Well, the book discusses that, explores that. Job searches for answers in it. It's a very long book. The presence of that and its length tells us at least a couple of things. Even within that storyline I've given you, the Bible still thinks the unjust suffering for any one individual is a question. It's an issue. It's an issue it wrestles with. But it's a very long book. It's not an issue where you can write the answers on a postcard. And in fact, the way that whole book goes on, what happens towards the end is Job is simply given a picture of God himself, a God, as it were, who is big enough and good enough that Job can trust him even if he doesn't have answers. So it might not sound satisfactory, and I appreciate that. But within the Bible's response, as it were, to suffering, is to point us to a picture of God, the God we see in Jesus, and say, would you trust him, even if you don't have a precise answer? Lastly, let me just echo John's comments that this question has both kind of big philosophical elements to it, and it also has heart-wrenching emotional elements to it. And I imagine we may each be coming at this from very different places. It might be an intellectual brain teaser for some of us. It might be a point of great sadness for others of us. In one sense, we've focused on the first. We've focused on what is the answer from a Christian point of view. What is the perspective Christianity gives us? But I just very, very much want to acknowledge the second of those. And as again John said, Christianity operates at both levels. Not a simple answer, but a perspective on why suffering is in the world, but also comfort within the experience of suffering itself. Those are the thoughts I had that I thought might be helpful to add. So we have a little bit of time now for any questions that you might have. There are a couple of ways of doing this, as I mentioned already. If you'd like to write a question in the chat, if you're unfamiliar with Zoom, you want to move your mouse on a laptop towards the bottom of the screen and click on the chat button, and you'll have the chance to write a question in the bottom. So feel very free to start writing questions in there now. If you're on the Facebook stream, then you can write questions in the comments section there, and Rob will look at those and then copy them across into the chat. If you'd like to ask a question direct, we can highlight you, as it were, and you can do that. And if you raise a hand, again, if you're unfamiliar with Zoom, put your mouse towards the bottom of the screen and click on participants. And on the right-hand side, a list of participants will come up, and there'll be a thing at the bottom that says raise hand. And if you click on that, we'll see that your hand is raised, and Rob will call on you to ask a question in a moment. So we just have one question in the chat so far, which is a fairly straightforward one. I don't think there'll be lots of questions or hardly any. So please, right away, let me just answer this one. Have you got details of the book from the speaker? We can probably put the details. I think Rob, Rob's nodding. Rob could put some details in the chat. It's called Where is God in a Coronavirus World by John Lennox. If you'd Googled that, you'd find it pretty quickly. But Rob will put some more precise details or a web link into the chat in a moment if you'd like to get it. It's a very short book, I can tell you that. There it is, there's the web link. It's available on Amazon. It's quite short. He did write it quite quickly. I think it's probably got a few, I feel it's got a few rough edges, but it's very good, very helpful. And amazingly, it's been translated into many languages already. Okay, would anyone like to raise a hand, or would anyone like to ask a question in the chat? This is where we could sit for a while. Aha, here's one. I was going to say we could sit for a while. I wouldn't want to draw it out and make it painful. We'll simply finish if there are no questions. But a few questions are just starting to come in. So someone says, in past crises, there has been a call to National Day of Prayer. Is it significant that this hasn't happened? It hasn't happened this time. I guess that's going to depend on our reading of our culture. Obviously, in the UK, we did have a far more Christian-influenced culture where people would, even if they weren't personal believers, as it were, they would accept some of the kind of broad outline of the Christian worldview, that there was a God, for example. And so things like a day of prayer would have made more sense and chimed with people. And I think it probably is significant that that hasn't happened, because that is reflective of where our culture is at. What prayer meant for people 50 years ago or more will be very difficult to say, but it was an instinct. Of course, it still is an instinct for many people to call out in times of distress. But yes, I guess I would say it is indicative of our cultures having moved away from that Christian worldview. Second question says, is it not part of the human condition that we only experience happiness because we know what its opposite feels like? That's an interesting question. Thank you for it. Certainly, I'd want to say that our experience of both poles, suffering and happiness, pleasure and pain, certainly, of course, they shed light on each other. I'd be cautious within the Christian worldview, though, of saying we can only experience happiness because of the opposite, because God originally made a world in which we could experience happiness. And the Christian hope is he will make such a world again where there won't need to be pain to know the opposite, as it were. So one can exist without the other. And in fact, that comes back to the Christian view of how the world was made. The world was made good, but then spoilt, twisted in some way. And the Christian view is not that kind of good and bad are equal and opposite in the world, as it were. Bad can only work off the good. It's good things that get spoilt. But the good thing that could be a good and pleasurable thing and a happy thing in itself, it can have an independent existence. Bad things only ever wreck those. It's a kind of parasite. Next question says, it seems particularly difficult that many victims are, say, healthcare workers or poor, marginalized. It seems unjust. Can you speak to that? Well, I can try. And well, first of all, would I want to agree? It does indeed seem unjust. And it is. It is unjust that those who would be caring for others would take the brunt of this. So unjust suffering happens in this world. And the Christian worldview, in a sense, wants to, as it were, support that and say, yes, unjust suffering exists. This is one of John's points about the atheist worldview, is it can't really use the word unjust. It's just what happens. But the Christian worldview says, no, that's wrong. That shouldn't happen. And many parts of the Bible, we have God saying, injustice like this shouldn't happen. Now, why he then allows it in any one case? Well, in one sense, we have the big story of why suffering is in the world, but we're not told the reasons for that person and this injustice. But we are told God cares about such injustice and will remedy it in time. The next question says, if we see this situation as God waking people up to the reality of our situation as mortals and sinners, those who've turned against God, those in need of rescue, should we be praying that God will take the problem away so no more people suffer? Well, there's another conundrum. Jesus commented on the tower falling and people being killed and said it wakes us up, it alerts us to the fact that the world isn't what it's supposed to be. And so John mentioned C.S. Lewis's comment that pain is God's megaphone. God is sort of shouting to the world in pain. He's speaking in a number of ways, but he's shouting in pain, as it were, trying to get our attention. Should we then say, pray to God, please take it away? Well, that's hard. If God is using it for that, if that is what God is doing, then we might want to say, well, that's a good thing that he's doing. And yet we also know that God cares for people in their suffering. We see this in the Lord Jesus when he meets people who have faced some sort of tragedy themselves. He responds not with, well, God's waking up to your suffering. He responds with compassion for them. So there is both the big picture, God could be doing this through suffering, but also that he cares for individuals. And so, yes, I think we do pray that suffering ceases, while at the same time even seeing that God might be doing something through it. Next one, and it's the last one at the moment, so do raise a hand or write another one if you'd like to.
I've got one, Graham, I'll relay in a minute.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Given the complexity and sensitivity of the issue, how can we witness to non-Christians at this time, or even offer a faith-based comfort? How can we, those of us who are Christians, make some kind of defense maybe, or present something of the hope of the gospel at this time? It's a very good question. In one sense, by covering some of the material John covered. It would depend, of course, where people are. Some people may, as I've said, take this kind of suffering to affirm their feeling there can't be a God. And maybe they're even angry at people saying there is. Whereas somebody else might be thinking, well, I'm looking for meaning in this. And what comfort can I possibly have in this suffering that I'm going through? my point of mentioning those two is we would respond very differently to those two. So I think the first thing we'd want to do is to listen carefully to where people are starting, what their questions are, but both to be able to say, Christians have thought about this for a long time. There are not simple answers, but there are perspectives that help us make sense, but also that there is comfort that we can offer. Rob, you've got a question from Facebook.
Yeah. So I guess a bit more of a specific question off the back of that one really is, if you knew someone was seriously ill with coronavirus and they weren't a Christian, what would you kind of want them to know before they died?
Well, thank you for whoever sent that in. Well, there are going to be lots of situations like that, I guess, both within this situation, but within life in general, people we know, again, those of us who are Christians who would want to say something to someone facing death. Well, again, it's going to vary hugely, isn't it, depending on our relationship with that person and what we know of where they are and what their starting point is. They may not want to hear anything from us, and we want to be respectful of people, but we also want to be urging and encouraging of people. And so I guess I'd want to ask questions. Have you thought about what lies beyond death? I'd want to point them to Jesus. Jesus says there is life beyond death and that there can be forgiveness in and through his death, that there is hope held out for you. So I'd want to be respectful of where they're at. I'd want to ask questions of what they're thinking. I want to ask questions that make them think more. I'd want to say something about what Jesus claims and what Jesus offers for himself. Any more questions from the Facebook page, Rob? No, he's shaking his head. No more questions currently on the chat, but a hand has gone up. Richard and Wendy College, if we could go to them. Yeah, over to you, Richard. Can you unmute yourself? There you go.
Am I? Yes, I am. Okay. Still asking me to unmute. Yeah, I was going to follow up on the previous question about whether we should be praying for the whole thing to end, and thinking, okay, we do want it to end. We think that God doesn't like see people suffering the way they are. But as a church, how should we be responding to this? Should we be calling days of fasting, having corporate prayer meetings? Should we be much more active in actually seeking God to say, take this away, please?
Yeah, thank you. I'm afraid your audio wasn't brilliant, Richard, but I think I got the majority of that. In one sense, for those of you who are within Grace, we're actually going to be spending some time praying specifically on Wednesday evening. I want to invite, I encourage people to be there. I do think we respond by praying particularly and praying into this situation. We always do so from a kind of position of humility. We don't know exactly what it is God is or isn't doing in it. We don't look to dictate to him in prayer, but we do call on him and ask for him to be active. A couple more questions have come in on the chat. God sent plagues when he was angry. That is in the Bible, we read that. Could he be angry with us? That's a very good question. I think what I'd say is that when we have plagues in the Bible, actually just what I think about it, Rob, am I spotlighted? Do you want to just bring me back? I have Richard and Wendy on my screen. Thank you very much. Richard and Wendy, you can do what you like now. When God sends plagues in the Bible, it's always with the explanation of a specific action. It is indeed an action of punishment against a particular nation or people for a particular reason. And so we have event and explanation. And so we can speak kind of confidently, as it were, as to what God said was happening there. What we have now is event, and we don't have a specific explanation. And that's why I think we should be extremely cautious about kind of adding our own explanation, particularly because there are other examples in the Bible, like the ones that John referred to with Jesus, where there is a moment of suffering, and Jesus refuses to say it's explicitly punishment on them. He doesn't draw that conclusion. He doesn't say it's meaningless. He says it should point us all to the idea that this world isn't as it should be, and we should turn back to God. But he doesn't say they were specifically deserving of it. It was an act of anger against them, and so we should be very careful not to say that ourselves. Another one has come in. Is not part of the problem that our secular culture sees no purpose in suffering, and therefore it is something that must be removed at all costs? Certainly, if you do any reading on the history of thought about suffering, I don't just mean from a Christian point of view, I mean just generally, it is in the last kind of century or something that the problem of suffering has become more of a problem for us. And a lot of people track that with the change in worldview about whether there is a God or not, but also what we are living for. That if the purpose and aim of life is basically to enjoy ourselves as much as possible, to be as comfortable as possible, to achieve our kind of dreams and so on, well, suffering is then a problem in the sense that it interferes where I think life should go and what I think life should be about. Whereas if people's worldviews, even if not Christian, were much broader than that, and for example, saw the place of suffering in developing character, as say some Greek philosophy did, well, actually then you have more of a place for it in the world. It's not just a problem for me making my life less comfortable because all I'm doing is aiming to be comfortable and enjoy myself. So I do think it is revealing within our usually kind of contemporary Western culture that actually, what are we living for? What is the meaning of life? Is it just comfort? And if it is, then we cannot see a place for suffering whatsoever. And the Christian worldview doesn't say it's just good medicine for you or something like that. It has a much more nuanced response. But it does then see a place in the lives of people, in how they respond to it and how they grow and how God uses it in people's lives. Well, let me pause again. Currently no more questions and no hands up. And I don't see any coming. So let me just start to summarize. Our time's almost gone anyway. I hope that's helpful. I mean, we've just scratched the surface in a sense. We've raised the question, we've put some pieces on the table. I don't want to pretend that we've done more than that. If you feel like we haven't done more than that, I agree with you completely. And what I'd want to do is to encourage you to think more wherever your starting point is. And if you'd like any guidance on that, any resources on that, obviously the book that's been mentioned could be a place to start. If you want to follow up with the person who invited you and ask them more questions, or get in touch with me you could go to our church website, Grace Church Cambridge, and there's a simple info@ email address, and that'll come through to me. If you'd like to use that at all, please feel very free. I just want to encourage you, wherever you're at, please do think more. I also want to say that this question is really significant, but it is not the heart of Christianity. Christianity needs to answer the question of suffering, but the message of Christianity, as John said, is actually